Michael Jackson's passing in 2009 sent shockwaves across the entire world. Fans wept in the streets, celebrities broke down on camera, and the memorial held in Los Angeles drew mourners from every corner of the globe. But amid all that grief, one absence stood out above everything else. The man who had sat behind the mixing board for some of the greatest albums ever made was nowhere to be found. Quincy Jones did not walk through those doors. And the reason why is far deeper than most people ever realized. On July 7, 2009, the Staples Center in Los Angeles became the center of the world. Over 17,500 people filled the arena, while more than 1.6 million ticket requests had flooded in within hours of the announcement. For those who couldn't attend in person, approximately 31 million Americans alone watched from their screens. Politicians, celebrities, and ordinary fans united in sorrow, laying flowers at every landmark connected to Michael's name and flooding the streets of Los Angeles in a tide of grief unlike anything the city had seen before. Yet for all the names on the guest list, one stood out by its absence. This was not some distant acquaintance or a minor figure in Michael's story. This was one of the most significant people in his entire career, someone who had been personally invited and knew the event was happening. He simply chose not to come. Quincy Jones had been more than just Michael Jackson's producer. He had been a driving force behind the transformation of a gifted young member of the Jackson 5 into the most iconic solo artist the world had ever seen. Michael loved Quincy, and by every account Quincy loved Michael back. Yet when the world gathered to say goodbye, Quincy mourned alone and in silence, far from the cameras and the crowds. His choice did not sit well with many people. Critics called it cold. Fans called it disrespectful. The question spread everywhere. How could the architect of Thriller, Off the Wall, and Bad simply stay home? How do you pour a decade of your life into someone's greatness and then not show up on the day the world honors them? Those questions were understandable. But they were also incomplete. Because the people asking them were only seeing the surface. And the truth about Quincy Jones lived much deeper than that. To understand why he stayed away, you first have to understand who Quincy Jones truly was, not just as a producer, but as a human being shaped by decades of extraordinary triumph and devastating loss. His was not a story that began with Michael Jackson. It began long before, in the poverty of 1933 Chicago, when a hungry young boy stumbled upon a piano one night while searching for food. That accidental encounter changed everything. From that moment, music became his world. He studied jazz, arranged for big bands, and went on to perform and collaborate with legends like Dizzy Gillespie, Count Basie, and Frank Sinatra. By the time Michael Jackson entered his orbit, Quincy Jones was already a towering figure in American music history. The two first crossed paths in 1978 on the set of The Wiz. When Michael asked Quincy to recommend a producer for his upcoming solo project, Quincy simply said he would do it himself. That decision produced Off the Wall in 1979, a landmark album that announced Michael Jackson as a solo force. Then came 1982, and Thriller changed everything. It remains the best-selling album in recorded history, with over 70 million copies sold worldwide. 5 years later, Bad arrived and broke yet another record, becoming the first album ever to produce 5 consecutive #1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100. Together, the 3 albums they created sold over 100 million copies combined. That is not just commercial success. That is a cultural fingerprint pressed permanently into the history of music. Their bond was built inside studios, in the quiet intensity of creation, in the trust that passes between two people making something they both believe in completely. So when the news broke in June 2009 that Quincy had not attended the memorial, the world wanted answers. What many people failed to notice at the time was that Quincy had already spoken. On June 25, 2009, the moment Michael's death was confirmed, Quincy released a statement calling it catastrophic. He said he was unable to find words. He described how fate had brought their souls together on The Wiz and how the music they made would echo through the world forever. Then he said something that should have silenced every critic immediately. He said he had lost his little brother, and that a part of his own soul had gone with Michael. This was not the language of a cold man. These were the words of someone absolutely broken by grief. When the news reached him, Jones was in London. He had just learned of the deaths of Ed McMahon and Farrah Fawcett within the same week. And then Michael's death landed on top of all of it. He described the experience as surreal, like something his mind simply could not process. He said he never had time to fully absorb it. But there was something else, something that went largely unnoticed in the coverage of his absence. Long before Michael Jackson died, Quincy Jones had made a quiet and deeply personal decision. He had decided he would no longer attend funerals. It was not a dramatic announcement or a public declaration. It was a private resolution, born out of an accumulation of loss that most people will never experience in a lifetime. He told the press simply that he wanted to remember people the way they were. Not lying in a casket. Not surrounded by formal mourning. He wanted to hold on to the living version of those he loved, and he refused to let a funeral be the final image that replaced all the others. This decision was not dramatic posturing. It was the result of being hollowed out by grief over many years. By the time Michael died, Quincy Jones had lost more than 150 people in roughly 2.5 years. Not acquaintances, not industry contacts, people he had loved, laughed with, created alongside, and called his own. He named Ray Charles. He named Marvin Gaye. He said plainly that 150 people in 2.5 years was simply enough. He could no longer walk into rooms full of flowers and caskets and look at the face of someone who had once been alive and vibrant and full of music. To fully grasp the weight of that, you have to go back to 1974, when doctors discovered that Quincy Jones himself had a life-threatening brain aneurysm at the age of 40. His survival was so uncertain that those close to him began organizing a memorial before he had even died. In one of the most surreal moments in music history, Jones attended that memorial himself, seated beside his neurologist at the Shrine Auditorium, watching Ray Charles, Marvin Gaye, and Billy Eckstine perform tributes in his honor while he was still alive. He later joked darkly that he had already been to his own funeral. Think about what that does to a person. You sit in a room and watch the people you love say goodbye to you while you are still breathing. You survive. And then, one by one, over the following decades, every single person who sang for you that night begins to disappear. Ray Charles goes. Marvin Gaye goes. Friend after friend, colleague after colleague, until every funeral becomes an echo of that first impossible night, each one heavier than the last. Michael Jackson was not simply another name in that long procession of loss. He was the young man Quincy had watched sing behind a couch in the studio because he was too shy to perform facing anyone directly. He was, in Quincy's own words, his little brother. For Quincy to stand in the Staples Center and grieve in front of 31 million people would not have felt like honoring Michael. It would have felt like performing grief, and after everything he had already endured, after every room he had sat in watching someone he loved reduced to eulogies and flowers, he had more than earned the right to say no. Not out of bitterness. Not because of unresolved tension between them. But because certain losses are simply too vast and too personal to be witnessed by a crowd. That is why Quincy Jones didn't go. He had said too many goodbyes already, and he was honest enough to admit it. When reporters caught up with him at London's Heathrow Airport in early July 2009, he didn't flinch or evade. He answered directly, with the calm of a man who had already made his peace with the decision. He said no, he would not be attending. He said the memorial was going to be surrounded by millions of people, and that was not what he wanted. His condolences had already been sent to the family. And then he said what mattered most. Being surrounded by 10 million people was not his idea of a tribute to someone whose soul had been joined with his. A piece of that soul, he said, had gone with Michael. That statement says everything. Quincy was not running from grief. He was refusing to reduce a bond that had been forged over a decade in dimly lit recording studios to a spectacle broadcast to 31 million screens. Mariah Carey performed. Stevie Wonder performed. Berry Gordy spoke. Cameras captured every movement and every tear. It was a magnificent public event, and it was exactly that. Public. It was not the place where thriller was built. It was not the place where a shy young man once hid behind a couch and sang his heart out. It bore no resemblance to what Quincy and Michael had actually shared. He had already said his farewell to Ray Charles. He had already said his farewell to Marvin Gaye. He had been saying farewells for years, and at some point the human heart simply has to draw a boundary. That is not weakness. That is survival. The last time Quincy saw Michael was at a dinner in London in May 2009, just weeks before his death. He remembered telling Michael he would see him again in Los Angeles. He never did. That dinner, that ordinary evening, that final conversation where neither of them knew it was the last one, that was what Quincy carried with him. Not a casket. Not a stadium full of cameras. A dinner in London. When he later spoke to students at Loyola Marymount University, he said he simply went off his rocker when he heard the news. He called it heavy. He spoke about how the bond between a producer and an artist, when it is real, must be built entirely on love, mutual respect, and trust. No pretense, no performance, just two people completely honest with each other. When two people have that, he said, it becomes something extraordinary. He had shared that with Michael. And when Michael died, he didn't only lose a friend. He lost that rare and irreplaceable thing they had built together. Their relationship was not without its complications, and that too is part of why Quincy stayed away. After the Bad album in 1987, the two parted ways professionally. Michael wanted more creative control, a stronger individual voice, new producers who would follow his lead rather than shape it. From 1991's Dangerous onward, Michael pursued a different path. Quincy did not speak much about it at the time, but years later he admitted that the separation had cut deeply. In a 2018 interview, he described a fundamental shift in how he saw the music industry at that point, carefully choosing his words but unable to fully hide what was beneath them. Something had changed between them that was never quite repaired. After Michael's death, the legal complications that followed added another difficult layer to the story. In 2013, Jones filed a claim against the Jackson estate for nearly $30 million in unpaid royalties related to his work on various recordings. In 2017, a jury awarded him $9.4 million, though an appellate court later reduced that figure to $2.5 million. The Jackson estate's lawyer publicly stated that Jones was the last person they expected to see challenging Michael's legacy. To some, the lawsuit looked opportunistic. To others, it was simply a working artist defending what he had legitimately earned. The reality was likely somewhere between both readings. What it reveals, most of all, is that Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson were fully human. Their relationship was warm and profound, yes, but it was also complicated, occasionally tense, and weighted with feelings that were never entirely spoken aloud before Michael was gone. That is not unusual for two creative people who spent a decade building something enormous together. In fact, it is almost inevitable. That complexity is precisely why Quincy could not stand at a podium that day and deliver a clean, simple tribute. Public grief demands a tidy narrative. It asks you to stand in front of cameras and speak only of love and legacy. It has no room for the messy, layered truth of a relationship that contained both extraordinary warmth and real wounds. Quincy felt all of it simultaneously, and none of it could be honestly expressed inside a stadium designed for celebration. The people who showed up that day loved Michael Jackson, many of them genuinely and deeply. But very few of them knew what it felt like to argue over the sound of a snare drum at 2 a.m. and still produce something that would outlast generations. Very few of them had experienced the particular ache of watching someone you helped shape grow beyond you, and learning to be proud of that even when it hurt. Quincy carried all of those things at once: pride and loss, warmth and wound, and there was simply nowhere to put any of it inside that arena. So he stayed away, not out of coldness, but because grief, real grief, needs room to be honest. And that day, there was no honest room to be found. Grief, at its truest, does not require an audience. It does not need cameras or crowds to be valid. The deepest grief lives in the smallest and quietest places, in moments no one else witnesses. Quincy had already sent his love to Michael's family. He had already issued a statement that, in its raw sincerity, surpassed most of the polished tributes delivered that day. He had already held his grief in London, privately, away from the world's gaze. The critics who accused him of coldness never understood what he had actually been doing. 4 years, loss after loss after loss, he had been carrying grief publicly, standing in rooms full of caskets and flowers, and at some point he simply made the decision that he would carry it differently. Not for the world, just for himself. People do not all grieve in the same way. Some need ritual and ceremony, the physical act of gathering to say goodbye. Others need silence, distance, and the privacy of personal memory. Neither is more valid than the other. The expectation that attending a funeral is the only true proof of love is a social convention, not a universal truth. What Quincy Jones was protecting when he stayed away was something no stadium could ever have contained. His private, unfiltered memory of who Michael Jackson actually was. Not the icon. Not the spectacle. The real Michael, the shy young man singing with his back to the room, the artist who trusted Quincy with his most vulnerable creative moments, the little brother whose soul Quincy believed had been permanently joined to his own. That version of Michael existed only in Quincy's memory, and Quincy chose to keep it there, safe and whole, untouched by ceremony. To love someone so deeply that no public event can adequately honor what they meant to you. To decide that the most truthful tribute is the one that remains entirely invisible to the world. That is not absence. That is devotion of the rarest kind. Quincy Jones passed away on November 3, 2024, at the age of 91. He died peacefully at home, surrounded by family. And in the vast legacy he left behind, in the albums and film scores and decades of music that will long outlive all of us, the memory of what he and Michael Jackson created together lives on. That is the tribute that has lasted. Not a stadium. Not a ceremony. The music itself still playing, still reaching people, still doing exactly what Quincy Jones always believed great music should do.